My mom told me that she went to Baruch College and she took psychology classes, and I think I can assume this is her old Psychology Today textbook. And this textbook was copyright in 1970. My mom came to the United States in 1972. So this is an old psychology textbook that was copyright in 1970. And they have a major chapter in this book called uh, Behavior Disorders, Chapter 27, Behavior Disorders. And this is what the introductory paragraph says. If abnormal persons did not exist, our notions of normality would be meaningless, for we judge ourselves in terms of the behavior of others. Unfortunately, normal and abnormal are strikingly relative terms, terms that have no absolute meaning. There is a statistical definition of normality and abnormality. Normal is what is average or usual, and abnormal is what differs from this standard. Such definition, however, is useless, primarily because it does not tell us how much of what is too much for most of us to accept. Normality might better be described in terms of approximations to an ideal state of moderation, as defined by a particular culture at a particular time. This criterion implies that each of us needs to achieve a balance in life that is neither self-destructive nor socially destructive. We must then balance impulse and action, manage stress in constructive ways, become autonomous, independent of others, and face reality for what it is and become competent in managing it. We may feel comfortable with our adjustment to life only to find that everyone else considers our actions, thoughts, and feelings to be bizarre, unusual, and socially deviant. The definition of what is or is not bizarre is relative to the society, the era, and the cultural mores of the moment. In the last decade, for example, our society has moved steadily in the direction of a less repressive attitude towards sex. The popular media have allowed freer access to sexual matters in writing, on the stage, and in films. Nudity, once forbidden, has become the vogue on stage and screen. The same degree of nakedness would have been considered bizarre not too long ago, and those who participated in it would have been labeled deviant. Finally, our production-oriented cultures uses efficiency and inefficiency as a basis for assessment of normality and abnormality. We are each called upon to fulfill specific roles based on sex, age, vocation, and social status, and the adequacy with which such roles are managed determines who is and who is not normal. When one fails to perform such social tasks in an appropriate manner, he is labeled abnormal. Thus, abnormal would be the term applied to an individual uncomfortable with his life, inefficient in performing the task required of him, and bizarre in his actions. Severe difficulty in any one of these three areas might be sufficient reason for society to label a person as being abnormal, as might a mild disorder in each of the three. One conclusion is evident. The notions of normality and abnormality are relative rather than absolute. They are useful abbreviations rather than statements of fact. And I could skip over the paragraph about neurosis, hysteria, and we could go to personality disorders, the psychopath. We could skip that and go to the sexual deviant. Let's see. Personality disorders. Neurotic behavior comes about through attempts to control anxiety and is clearly abnormal. Other kinds of abnormality does not necessarily based on anxiety include such personality disorders as psychopathy and sexual deviance. In each case, the person's lifestyle is marked by a limited capacity to adapt to circumstances, with a consequent rigid and unsuccessful attempt to establish a rational, stable, rewarding relationship to the environment and the people who inhabit it. The behavior of such persons appears socially inappropriate and, on closer inspection, is found to be inflexible, self-defeating, unstable, and immature. Most theorists believe that these disorders are based on anxious and painful childhood experiences that the developing person has not coped with successfully. The adult with a disordered personality acts out his conflicts in ways that bring rejection, censure, and punishment by the better adjusted members of society. Those with personality disorders have failed to learn socially acceptable ways of resolving conflict and attaining gratification of their needs. And here under personality disorders, we have the sexual deviant. A deviant is one who departs from accepted standards of proper behavior. Yet, it is common knowledge that private sexual behavior regularly differs from the public standards set for it. Normal sexual behavior is relative to what consenting adults agree to in private, but popular opinion labels certain forms of sexual expression as sick or disordered. The professional clinician, in contrast, is concerned about sexual activity primarily when it is disordered by being compulsive, exclusive, destructive, accompanied by great anxiety and guilt, bizarre, inefficient, or the cause of discomfort. Each of us has a bisexual sexual identity. We learn to feel, think, and act appropriate masculine or feminine roles. For some, however, the supposedly smooth road to mature sexual adjustment proves to be rocky. Fears of normal sexual encounter develop, and socially forbidden sexual activities become more attractive. Thus, sexual satisfaction may be sought with such inappropriate objects as members of same sex, homosexuality, children, pedophilia, animals, bestiality, blood relatives, incest, or inanimate symbolic objects, fetishism. Deviation can take the form of such variations in intensity and frequency of sexual urges as impotence or esaterus in the male and the frigidity or the nymphomania in the female. Moreover, there are deviations in sexual gratification that can be attained only by means of oral genital contact, fellatio, or the penis colungus of the female genitalia, and the anal genital contact, sodomy, between adult males, pederasty, between the man and boy, manual or mechanical stimulation, masturbation, displaying the genitalia, exhibitionism, observation of the genitalia or sexual activity of others, voyeurism or scatophilia, or wearing the clothing of the opposite sex, transvestite, is labeled deviant. Further, to be considered normal, sexual pleasure should be attainable without inflicting mental or bodily pain, sadism, or being the victim of such pain, masochism. Frequency and intensity. Because sex is such a vital part of the total self, an important man or a frigid woman may experience more anxiety in our culture than he or she would as members of less competitive, accomplishment-oriented society. There are several kinds of impotence. The male may be unable to achieve an erection, may be unable to attain it long enough to accomplish a sexual act, or may come to the orgasm too soon to satisfy the female. A male may be impotent because he fears that he will not perform in a credible fashion, or because he is inhibited and made anxious by intimate contact with a female. Frigidity may cause a woman to suffer a severe loss of self-esteem. She is not a complete woman because she is repelled by male advances, is usually difficult to arouse sexually, or has intercourse without full and satisfying response. These kinds of restricted responses to sexual experience may be based on such realistic fears as pregnancy or disease, or they may reflect an inhibited guilt over sexuality. Disorders of excess, like satirus male and nymphomania female, are judged to exist not because some persons are far more active sexually than the average, but because sexual encounter with a variety of partners reflect a disorder of motivation and emotional involvement in the act. When the urge to sexual contact has a characteristically obsessive or compulsive quality to it, it becomes apparent that sex is being used to satisfy some non-sexual needs. Promiscuous sexual relations, for example, might be used to punish hated parents by flaunting the standards they taught. Deviant moods. Any method of achieving sexual gratification other than heterosexual contact of the male and female genitalia used to be considered a perversion. Today, it is considered normal for heterosexual activity to include a variety of modes of sexual stimulation. But when other than genital activity is the exclusive source of sexual pleasure, it is labeled deviant. Thus, exclusively oral genital or anal genital modes of sexual gratification are considered deviant because they fall short of full heterosexual expression. For some persons, sexual satisfaction comes not from intercourse, but from the act of looking at the naked sexual object. These persons, known as voyeurs or peeping toms, do not fill the seats of a burlesque house, movies promising nakedness, or cafes with topless waitresses. Nor are they the secret peekers at the girly magazines. The voyeur must spy on his object without her knowledge. He fears women and feels inadequate with them. This harmless, immature male gets his pleasure in part from spying on naked women without their knowledge or permission. It is this secret invasion of their privacy that fascinates him. Deviant exhibitionism is primarily a male sexual activity. The male who exhibits his penis and masturbates when he has someone's attention is not inviting the female to have intercourse. He is rather trying to reassure himself of his maleness by demonstrating that his sex organ is so powerful and potent that it makes women run away frightened. The exhibitionist feels deeply guilty about his behavior, but reports that he is unable to manage this impulse when the urge overtakes him. Transvestism. Another male preoccupation is the donning of female clothing and acting out of the feminine side of an otherwise masculine personality. The transvestite feels like a woman, acts like a woman, and becomes a female version of himself. The sexual stimulation and gratification he experiences are produced both by genital contact with the female undergarments and by the sense of being fused into a woman-man. Contrary to popular belief, transvestites are not always active homosexuals. Finally, among the deviant modes of sexual gratification are sadism and masochism. Sexual pleasure achievable only when coupled with pain or humiliation is considered deviant. This is not to say that rough sexual play is abnormal. It is rather to underscore the fact that sexual and aggressive impulses and urges can become entangled in such a way that it's difficult to determine which is dominant in the sexual relation. Some males can only be potent when abusing, or humiliating females. Some females can only be aroused sexually when totally subservient to an abusive male. Male sadism in sexual encounter was once described as rape with permission. Because the male seems incapable of relating to a female unless he has beaten her into submission and rendered her harmless. Deviant objects. Homosexuality in males and lesbianism in females have always been a part of human existence, but the frequency has varied from era to era and from culture to culture. Although an estimated one-third to one-half of the male population has had at least some homosexual experience, only about 4% of the population is exclusively homosexual. Some latent homosexuals have powerful urges that never reach open expression in sexual encounter but appear only in such secondary forms as feminine interests, hobbies, and effeminate mannerism. Homosexuality is at, is at least as complicated a sexual interpersonal relationship as is heterosexuality. Thus, to describe homosexuality in grossly simple terms like masculine and feminine or active and passive is to pretend that some persons are not capable of enjoying both homosexual and heterosexual contacts. Homosexuals are more active than heterosexuals, more concerned with sexuality, and more adolescent in their relationship. They are aware early in life that they are different from social expectations, and although they try not to excuse their condition on rational grounds, their confused problems of sexual identity indicate otherwise. It is the choice of object that society labels as deviant. Theorists have attempted for years to account for this choice. As yet, there is no reliable evidence that grandeur, there is any biological, granular, or inherited basis for homosexuality. Theorists believe, rather, that the deviant choice of a sexual object is forced on the individual as a consequence of failure to learn the socially prescribed sexual roles or because of distortions introduced into the learning process. Males selecting other males as sexual objects have been a prime concern in our society. Less attention is directed to lesbian relationships, in part because female homosexuality is less aggressive and such relationships are more easily disguised. After all, two women living together stimulate less gossip than the same living arrangement for two males. Moreover, females tend to establish longer-lasting homosexual relationships than do men. In this respect, males are more volatile, immature, and less reliable as partners. Another deviation in choice of sexual object takes place in the form of fetishism. Sexual stimulation provided by an inanimate object rather than people. Many fetish objects, such as female underclothing, have at least a symbolic relationship to a conventional heterosexual object. That is, they represent a heterosexual experience the fetish is unable to manage. In a fetish, the part equals the whole, and the sexual satisfaction is achieved when the object and fantasies of experience are combined. The most censored sexual deviances are pedophilia, incest, and bestiality. As far as sex is concerned, children are the sacrosanct. Adults choose children for sexual molestation in great part because a child is less threatening, is easier to influence and control, and is less likely to reject the amorous pursuer. Children are safe, anxiety-free objects for sexuality. When sexual acts occur with such uncomprehending victims, it is most often a case of a totally or partially impotent male who gives in to his impulses under the influence of alcohol with a young female who is related or known to him. Most often, too, the sexual encounter involves masturbatory activity, exhibitionism, or sexual fondling. Few sexual deviants voluntarily represent themselves for therapeutic remedy. Deviants caught up in the coils of the law or anxious deviants, perhaps with an overlay of severe personality disorder, are those most likely to seek treatment. The sexual deviants whose problems are not personally annoying or publicly visible are reluctant to expose themselves because there are harsh social penalties for their way of life. And that's basically, Homosexuality 1970. this is really has been the longest YouTube I've ever had in my life.